I have explained in my settings guide video about how multipliers work, but settings are quite complex, and today I'm here to share a bit more about what I know specifically about multipliers. So it's very obvious that the multiplier tells you the amount of screen time a node is getting, not in a measurement time but as a placeholder value that can be compared to other settings. What I didn't say is that there are ways that the screen time of your nodes can be affected without changing your multiplier. One very common way of changing your multiplier, making it faster, is by raising the fade-in length. This makes it so that the nodes fade in at the back when they spawn, which makes the time where they are in full opacity smaller. And while that doesn't directly affect the screen time the nodes have, it does give the impression of using a higher multiplier since you tend to notice less nodes that are further down the back. Another very common way of raising the multiplier, and one that many people might not even realize it does, is by enabling node fade or half ghost. That setting makes so that the node fades out during the hit window period, which means they spend less time on screen. Similar to the fade-in length effect, the nodes are spending the same amount of time on the screen, but since they fade sooner, it makes it look like they're spending less time on screen than what they actually are, which gives the impression of a higher multiplier. The last very common way of changing your multiplier without changing either the AR or AD is by enabling node pushback. That setting makes it so that nodes only disappear behind the grid, which makes the nodes stay on screen for a longer period of time, effectively lowering the multiplier. You might think that enabling node fade or node pushback poses almost no change to the multiplier, and you would be right. Those settings affect a much more important thing than the multiplier, and that is the feeling of hitting the nodes. But I do think it is interesting that those settings can affect how you perceive the multiplier of a specific setting. On the other hand, changing the fade-in length to affect the multiplier is a known way of keeping the settings as is but making them a little bit cleaner to read. People who use higher ADs tend to like having high fade-in lengths because the extra space makes it better to read nodes on a lower opacity. Since the nodes are spaced further away from each other, the effect of having a high fade-in length can help a lot in making reading easier because of the higher sensation of a multiplier, and yet not making non-massive patterns harder to read since you can still read nodes with a lower opacity. But players who use lower ADs tend to prefer to keep fade-in length either low or zeroed. This is because when you don't have a lot of space to play with and you try fading the nodes in, it makes the setting more prone to rapid fade and it makes the feel of it much faster than what it would usually be. On lower AD, it seems to be much harder to read things like jumps, even if they're using the same low multiplier as on a higher AD. Even if the multiplier dictates the amount of screen time a node has, it doesn't dictate the spacing between nodes, since that's the AR's job. This means that even though the screen time is exactly the same, the spacing between nodes being smaller and the nodes being clustered closer together due to the lack of AD can easily cause confusion when doing complex patterns like jumps. In those situations where the spacing makes things cluttered, using a dual color mesh can help with reading patterns more than you'd think. Guiding yourself with the alternating colors can genuinely be a helpful thing to distinguish the rhythm. This is specifically true when you use a lower AD, as the colors create a visual separation that the spacing itself fails to provide. On the other hand, when you're facing a massive pattern like streams on a lower AD, the experience is completely different. These continuous patterns become noticeably easier to read. Because the nodes are still moving pretty slow due to the low AR, you seem to have more time to process the sequence. Furthermore, reading streams isn't inherently hard under the conditions since the pattern itself is very predictable, with very few mechanical changes from map to map. The condensed spacing actually keeps the entire stream neatly within your vision. But when you talk about higher ADs, things basically flip. Because the spacing between nodes is much higher due to the higher AR, and the artificial spacing is also higher because of the higher AD, it becomes much easier to differentiate between the nodes that are closer and the ones further back. And when you're doing more massive patterns like streams, it becomes harder to follow them since even though they have the same screen time as the ones with the lower AD, they're still way faster than those, which makes it harder to react to streams. How settings feel isn't as simple as knowing multipliers or knowing the effects of each setting like I just explained. While this knowledge can help you understand how to make settings better for your situation, it also means that there are more things that can go wrong when copying someone else's settings. Settings are highly personal. You can't just grab someone else's settings and expect them to fit you perfectly. It's normal to adapt people's settings, and it's also normal for you to need time to adapt to your own new settings. If your monitor is closer or further away from you, if your sense is lower or higher, if your mouse is lighter or heavier, if your monitor is big or small, with a low or high refresh rate, with a low or high brightness, these can all be changes that affect your feel on playing a certain configuration. And while you might think that those things are too small to be noticeable, they do pile up. When they do pile up enough, they start being the difference between something you're comfortable using and something that feels weird. Adapting to new settings and adapting settings to you should be the things that you're constantly doing. There's no one size fits all, and even the most experienced of players change their settings all the time. They don't change their settings because for however long they used their last settings they disliked it. They changed it because they have changed. And so their settings need to change too. When I take breaks from the game, even if they are 2 or 3 day breaks, when I come back to playing, my settings already feel weird. Adapting back onto my settings would take me longer and feel worse than just adapting what I feel like isn't working well for me. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel and it lets me know that people enjoy this kind of content. I'm also working on Ancillion, a project that brings together some of the best soundspace resources in one place. Instead of having to dig through Discord servers, old forum posts, or scattered downloads, Ancillion aims to make things easier to find with a curated collection of articles, custom maps, skins, an SSPM library, and other community resources. If you'd like to check it out, you'll find a link in the description along with the full script for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.